You don't need to find God because He was never far from you. Your whole life you were taught to search outside yourself, love in other people, peace in certain places, meaning in achievements. But what if all of that was just distraction? Jesus said, "The kingdom is within," and that's a dangerous truth because it removes every excuse. You can't blame the world, your family, or your past anymore once you understand the key was always in your hands. This isn't a video about religion. It's about reunion, about hearing the inner Christ calling, learning the kind of forgiveness that sets you free, and carrying the cross that doesn't destroy, but transforms. And I'm not going to hand you easy answers. This path demands that you cross deserts, face shadows, and be reborn more than once. But if you stay until the end, you'll understand why this journey may be the most important step you can take right now. So subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because here we go straight to the point, straight inward, where light and shadow embrace and the soul finds rest. There is a silent call that echoes deep in the soul, an ancient and mysterious presence that transcends time and space, a force that lives beyond words and superficial beliefs. It is the inner Christ, that divine spark Carl Jung recognized as the living symbol of the self, the sacred center of the psyche, where light and shadow intertwine in an eternal dance. This meeting doesn't happen in temples or through external rituals. It happens in the silence of the heart, in that moment when the soul turns inward and hears a whisper it had never noticed before. It is an invitation to step out of fragmentation and chaos, to recognize that within each of us there is a cross carrying the pain and rebirths that shape the journey. It is in this presence that the true path of spirituality begins, the kind that does not run from suffering, but transforms it into strength and compassion. This call is an intimate encounter, a presence that doesn't impose itself, but invites a silent revolution. The inner Christ speaks the language of forgiveness, not the easy kind, but the kind that demands courage to look at your wounds without fear, to embrace your own shadow with compassion. It is the moment when the ego begins to give way to the self, when the persona that pretended to be enough falls in the face of the truth of what we truly are. It is a rebirth that comes from deep acceptance, from shedding masks, from surrendering to the flow of life. To nurture this encounter, practices like meditation, inner silence, and reflecting on biblical passages through a Jungian lens can be powerful allies. This presence isn't far away. It lives in every breath, in every gesture of self-compassion. And yet, it is not easy to answer this call. Facing the inner Christ means facing your own cross, the pain that transforms, the vulnerability that sets you free. It is recognizing that light and shadow coexist within us, and that only by accepting both can we find rest for the soul. Jung reminds us that this process is a journey of rebirth, where every step is an act of courage and love. Spirituality, in this sense, becomes the art of living in communion with what is deepest and most sacred within us. The call touching you now is only the beginning of a path that, though challenging, promises the most profound reconciliation with the inner Jesus, with the self, and with life itself. The next step in this walk is to discover the reflection of that true love, which begins in the way you look at yourself. Loving yourself is, above all, an act of courage, especially in a world that constantly teaches us the opposite. Society often confuses self-love with selfishness, vanity, or narcissism, and it's easy to get lost in that tangle of other people's opinions. Carl Jung, however, pointed out that love for oneself is the foundation upon which any true relationship can be built. The reflection of true love is not found in someone else, but in the ability to look within, to accept yourself, even with all the imperfections the persona insists on hiding. It is in this intimate encounter that the true alchemy of spirituality begins, where forgiveness and compassion act as keys, opening doors to deep emotional freedom. Loving does not mean seeking perfection, but embracing vulnerability and respecting yourself in every layer of your psyche. Self-love is the seed that once planted, grows and nourishes all other forms of love. The lesson of true love is not just philosophical. It shows up in daily practice, in simple gestures, in kind words you speak to yourself in the silence of your mind. It is not enough to acknowledge that we should love ourselves. This love needs to be exercised moment by moment. That means forgiving the mistakes of the past, welcoming the shadows that appear unexpectedly, and nurturing the inner child, that sacred part of you the world taught you to hide. The inner Jesus, symbol of compassion and forgiveness in Jungian psychology, mirrors this unconditional love that can heal and transform. For those seeking to strengthen this connection, practices such as compassion-focused meditation, therapeutic writing, and deep self-reflection are powerful tools. They help break the vicious cycle of self-criticism and create a space where true acceptance can flourish, free from the judgments of the ego mind. The impact of self-love extends far beyond yourself, shaping the quality of your relationships with others. When you truly love yourself, you stop seeking in another the validation that can only come from within, changing the very dynamic of the bonds you form. Jung suggested that this love is the force that allows individuation to expand, touching communities and resonating in the collective unconscious. The reflection of true love is a mirror that gives back what you offer. If you give yourself forgiveness and compassion, you receive that same energy in return. This exchange creates a field of authenticity and freedom, breaking away from relationships based on dependency or fear. And it is this openness that leads us to the next stage of the journey, the light that reveals the shadow, where truth heals, even if it unsettles, and continues the process of inner rebirth. True light is not just brightness, it is the revelation that uncovers what has been hidden in the shadows of our being, the parts we refuse to see. Carl Jung taught that the shadow, that hidden side of the psyche we often carry with shame or fear, can only be integrated when brought to consciousness, illuminated by the light of presence. This light, however beneficial, is not comfortable. It exposes old wounds, deep fears, and uncomfortable truths that the persona tries to hide at all costs. Yet this revelation is essential for the transformation and rebirth of the self. Without this clarity, the shadow works behind the scenes, guiding our steps in unconscious and self-sabotaging ways. In spirituality, this process is seen as the path of true healing, a call to embrace the totality of our being, including both the light and the darkness within. Living in this light means accepting discomfort with courage and compassion, embracing a continuous journey where the ego gradually loses ground to the self. Every step into the shadow is a step toward deeper self-knowledge. This unsettling light forces us to let go of old illusory narratives, to dismantle false identities, to acknowledge parts of ourselves we once considered unacceptable. In this movement, forgiveness begins to sprout both for ourselves and for others, freeing us from the chains of the past. This is the essence of deep spirituality, transformation born from the radical acceptance of inner duality, where light and shadow unite to make us whole. A practical example of this revelation is the exercise of honest self-observation, which can be supported by therapy, meditation, or contemplative practices. It's about welcoming uncomfortable thoughts and emotions without judgment, allowing the light of consciousness to penetrate the inner darkness. It is a painful process that requires facing our own imperfections, but it is precisely in this confrontation that the possibility of rebirth arises. The inner Christ, symbol of this rebirth, guides us beyond the cross of pain toward deep compassion and healing. Accepting this light prepares the ground for the next step in the journey, forgiveness that breaks old chains. True forgiveness is not a simple act, much less a favor granted to someone else. It is, above all, an inner liberation, a spiritual courage to let go of the weight of past chains that keep the self imprisoned. Carl Jung reminds us that forgiveness is one of the essential bridges in the journey of individuation, because it allows the soul to breathe and life to flow again. Forgiving does not mean forgetting or validating the wrong done. It means choosing not to carry the suffering as a constant burden. In practice, this forgiveness can begin with small gestures, looking at our own failures without judgment, accepting imperfections, and understanding that the mistakes of others often reflect our own unintegrated shadows. Spirituality teaches that the act of forgiving creates space for compassion, and that compassion is the true rebirth. Releasing these old chains requires a daily exercise of presence and intention. It is not something accomplished all at once, but a continuous process that demands patience and brutal honesty with oneself. It is common that, in trying to forgive, the mind brings memories and pains back to the surface, as if the ego were resisting surrender. Yet it is in this very confrontation that forgiveness gains depth. Jung saw forgiveness as a cross to be carried, a personal sacrifice that opens the way to inner healing. Practicing forgiveness means facing discomfort, confronting suffering without running away, and allowing ourselves to be reborn. Exercises such as therapeutic writing, heart-centered meditation, and even symbolic rituals can help solidify this process of release. The forgiveness that truly frees is not only for the past but also for the present and the future. It teaches us that holding on to grudges is like bearing an invisible cross that prevents the self from fully blooming. Jung reinforces that the inner Christ lives precisely in that space of surrender and transformation, where the weight of suffering becomes the impulse for compassion and unconditional love. When we forgive, the soul opens to the light that dissolves shadows and creates a new beginning, a continuous rebirth. This process sets the stage for the next step of the journey, the non-judgmental gaze, which is born from the compassion cultivated through forgiveness. Looking without judgment is a rare and revolutionary art, especially when applied first to ourselves. Carl Jung said that the shadow, so often rejected and hidden, only finds space for transformation when it is seen with eyes that welcome rather than condemn. Deep psychology shows that the ego's natural tendency is to judge, to separate good from bad, right from wrong, acceptable from unacceptable, in order to maintain a false sense of control and safety. But constant judgment is a prison. It builds invisible walls that block the flow of compassion and forgiveness, keeping us stuck in old patterns and wounds. Looking without judgment means seeing our own fragility and the imperfections of others with the same tenderness, recognizing that everyone carries their own crosses and scars. Ultimately, it is an act of deep love that disarms both internal and external criticism, opening the door to healing and the rebirth of the self. Practicing this gaze requires full awareness and discipline because the habit of judgment is deeply rooted and subtle. It is in everyday life, in the small moments of irritation, in silent criticism, in flashes of intolerance, that we are called to pause and remember. The other person, like me, is a soul in process, carrying pains and stories I may never know. Jung saw this compassion as a bridge to individuation, a passage that frees us from the illusions of the ego and brings us closer to the authentic self. To cultivate this gaze, practices like metta-meditation, loving-kindness meditation, active empathy exercises, and reflecting on our own flaws and limits are essential. These practices create an internal field of acceptance where judgment loses ground and love begins to flourish, even in the face of imperfection. This non-judgmental gaze is what allows us to rebuild relationships, not only with others, but also with the world and with ourselves. It dissolves the chains of fear, guilt, and shame, opening the way for more authentic and profound connections. In spirituality, this quality is seen as a direct reflection of the presence of the inner Christ, who teaches us to look at the world with compassion and humility. Jung pointed out that this inner transformation is essential for the self to emerge and act with integrity. And it is this very gaze that leads us to the next stage of the journey, the return to the sacred child. That recovery of innocence and authenticity the world taught us to hide, but which remains alive in the heart of the soul. Returning to the sacred child is not an invitation to relive childhood in the literal sense, but to recover that state of purity, curiosity, and authenticity that once lived in us before we learned to wear masks to survive. Carl Jung recognized that this inner child is not just a memory, but a living archetype, an essential fragment of the self that holds the essence of the soul. It is the part of us that knows how to play for no reason, to love without calculation, to trust without reservation. Over time, however, that space is buried under emotional wounds, social expectations, and the weight of responsibilities. Returning to this child means peeling away, layer by layer, the conditioning of the ego, until we once again find that divine spark connecting us to living spirituality, to the inner Christ dwelling in the heart. It is allowing laughter, imagination, and spontaneity to become acts of healing, rather than remnants of a lost innocence. This return is not simple because it means facing the wounds that once drove the child away from us. Many times, this inner child was hurt by harsh words, by the absence of love, or by patterns that denied its authenticity. Jung taught that ignoring this part of ourselves keeps the wound open in the unconscious, silently shaping our relationships, choices, and behaviors. To rescue it is to offer what it never had: care, safety, and space to exist without fear. This can happen through simple yet profound practices: writing letters to your younger self, revisiting memories with compassion, allowing yourself moments of creativity with no purpose other than joy. In this process, self-forgiveness and forgiveness toward those who, consciously or not, harmed this child become possible. In doing so, we open space for the self to fully manifest, reintegrating this vital part of the soul. When the sacred child returns to its place on the throne of the soul, it offers us something precious: the ability to live with freshness and presence. Spirituality becomes lighter, love becomes more genuine, and relationships become more authentic. It's as if, by reconnecting with this essence, we could finally look at life without the lens of distrust, welcoming both light and shadow with curiosity rather than fear. And when this child is integrated, it naturally leads us to the next step of the journey: the crossing of the cross. Because just as Christ carried the cross to the moment of rebirth, we too are called to accept the inevitable pains of the path, not as punishment, but as portals to a deeper, truer life. The crossing of the cross is the point where spirituality stops being a concept and becomes embodied experience. It is the moment when there is no longer any way to avoid pain, and the road ahead necessarily means carrying it. Carl Jung saw the cross not only as a Christian symbol, but as an archetypal representation of the weight each human being is called to bear in order to reach rebirth. It is not about seeking suffering, but about accepting it when it arrives, recognizing that it carries a hidden purpose. A personal cross can take the form of loss, crisis, inner conflict, or inevitable rupture. Avoiding it only prolongs the process. Carrying it allows the soul to be shaped by the experience itself. The inner Christ is not a distant myth. He appears when, after falling, we choose to rise with dignity, even if the ground is still stained with blood and tears. The weight of the cross reveals hidden forces the ego tries to conceal. It is then that we realize spirituality is not a refuge from life, but a call to dive into it with radical courage. The cross demands full presence. We cannot carry it distracted or numb because it pulls us back into the raw reality of existence. It is also here that forgiveness and compassion stop being pretty ideas and become a vital necessity. Forgiving those who have hurt us and even ourselves does not mean minimizing the pain. It means preventing it from becoming a lifelong prison. There are practices that can help in this crossing. Meditating daily on the meaning of suffering, keeping a journal for self-understanding, or seeking inspiration in sacred texts that remind us the path of the cross is also the path to inner victory. When we cross the cross, something within us breaks to make room for what is eternal. It is in this breaking that rebirth becomes possible. Just as Christ in surrender found glory, we are invited to understand that surrender is the key to freedom. There is no resurrection without death, no rebirth without leaving behind what no longer serves us. The cross is not the end, but the bridge to a new stage where the soul, lighter and stronger, draws closer to its truest form. And after the weight and the crossing, there comes a deep silence, the inner desert, where the tired ego finally falls quiet and the soft voice of the soul is heard clearly for the first time. The desert is the place where the soul is stripped of all the ornaments the ego has collected. It is where the external voices fall silent, and, to our discomfort, we realize how dependent we had been on them to define ourselves. Carl Jung understood the desert as a symbolic space, inevitable in the journey of individuation, the point where there are no distractions left to hide the shadows. In the silence of the desert, we discover that many of the noises we thought came from the world were in fact echoes of our own fear. There is no shortcut through it. You have to walk, step by step, even when no horizon is in sight. Spirituality here is not a comfort, but a mirror reflecting exactly who we are. And as we endure that vision, we begin to realize the silence is not emptiness, but fertile ground waiting for the right seed. In the desert, solitude is not an accident, but a tool of refinement. It forces us to face ourselves without filters, without an audience, without performance. It is the moment when the inner Christ sits beside us, not to take us out of there, but to teach us to listen. And what we hear is not only gentle words, but also direct confrontations with our inconsistencies, with the unforgiveness we still carry, with the selective compassion we offer. Here, practices such as conscious fasting, contemplative prayer, and long walks in silence become doors to self-knowledge. The desert is not conquered by haste, but by the willingness to remain. And the longer we remain, the more we realize that the noise we feared was actually the fear of being alone with our own heart. When we finally surrender to the silence of the desert, something shifts. The ego, tired of trying to keep control, yields. And in that yielding, the soul finds its voice. In this space, forgiveness blooms without effort, compassion expands without calculation, and the cross we once carried begins to feel lighter. The desert, once seen as punishment, reveals itself as a sacred retreat where life prepares us for true abundance. It is no coincidence that so many spiritual masters have walked through it before fulfilling their purpose. The silence of the desert is the antechamber of an inexhaustible source, one that doesn't depend on external circumstances to flow. And when we leave it, we are not the same. We carry within us an invisible reservoir, ready to overflow whenever the world needs the water we found there. True abundance is not in what we accumulate, but in what flows through us. Carl Jung would say that this source is the self, the living center of our psyche, where light and shadow unite to generate a constant flow of life. This source doesn't depend on favorable circumstances, on applause, or on external achievements. It springs from somewhere much deeper, the encounter with the inner Christ. It is the realization that we don't need to hoard every drop for fear of running out. On the contrary, the more we give, the more we realize the flow increases. But to access this source, we must break the dams the ego has built over the years, the dams of fear, resentment, guilt, and lack of forgiveness. In doing so, spirituality stops being theory and becomes living practice, a way of being that nourishes ourselves and others without depleting anyone. The source that never runs dry is not found in books, though they may point the way. It reveals itself in the daily practice of opening the heart, even when the world seems undeserving. It is choosing compassion when it would be easier to build walls. It is offering a cup of water, literally or symbolically, even when we feel we have little. It is embracing the cross of generosity without expecting anything in return, understanding that the return is already in the act of giving. In practical terms, this means being present to listen to a friend without checking the time, dedicating moments to serve without wanting recognition, or simply smiling at someone the ego might deem unworthy of attention. These gestures may seem small, but together they keep the flow of the source alive and constant. And the more we flow, the more we realize that abundance has nothing to do with quantity, but with the quality of our giving. What's most remarkable about this source is that it turns us into channels, not reservoirs. A reservoir holds back for itself, afraid of the end. A channel lets everything pass through, trusting that more will always come. This is when we understand that true abundance is not luck, but a spiritual stance. It's not only about material generosity, but a willingness to give presence, attention, forgiveness, and love, even when it costs us something. This is the same logic as spiritual rebirth, dying to inner scarcity and rising to complete trust in the flow of life. When we drink from this source, we see it everywhere, but it's only visible to those who have crossed the desert and learned to hear the sound of water in the silence. And in recognizing it, we are naturally led to the next step, the return to the kingdom that has always been within us. The kingdom is not some distant place reserved for after death. It is a state of consciousness we can access now. In speaking of individuation, Carl Jung described this point as the full encounter with the self, the center where all parts of our psyche finally recognize and embrace one another. Jesus said, "The kingdom of God is within you." And this phrase, when truly understood, disarms every external search. It is the moment we realize there's no more struggle, because the battle between light and shadow has become a dance. The kingdom is the state in which we don't need to prove anything to anyone, nor hide parts of ourselves to be accepted. It is not won by force or imposition, but by surrender, the conscious yielding to the flow of life, trusting that we are already where we need to be. It is peace that depends on nothing, joy that time cannot steal. Finding this kingdom requires walking through the earlier stages: forgiveness, compassion, acceptance of the cross, and the crossing of the desert. It is as if each stage were a key, and each key opened an inner door, leading us closer to this center. Spirituality at this point stops being effort and becomes natural breathing. You wake up already knowing you are connected, not because you performed a ritual, but because living itself has become prayer. The ego, once shouting for control, now speaks in whispers, aware that a greater order is guiding everything. And here's the practical side. This kingdom shows itself when we treat the small things of daily life with reverence, from washing dishes to listening to someone with full attention. The sacred ceases to be only in what is grand and begins to inhabit the everyday. When the kingdom is within, there is no more need to chase what we already are. It is the experience of deep rest, where there is no urge to compete, prove, or seek approval. Generosity flows naturally because we no longer feel lack. Compassion comes easily because we know we are part of the whole. Forgiveness becomes inevitable because we understand the other is also on a journey. This state doesn't mean the absence of challenges, but the certainty that every challenge is an opportunity to express this kingdom. It is the spiritual maturity of one who knows life is not about winning or losing, but about remembering who we've always been. And perhaps, at this point, silence speaks louder than words, because one who has found the kingdom no longer needs to convince anyone, only to live in a way that inspires others to realize that, just like us, they too carry this sacred place within. You can spend your whole life searching out there, or you can decide right now to open the door that has always been inside. The inner Christ doesn't shout, doesn't force, doesn't invade. He calls. And if you ignore him, the world will keep trying to fill that emptiness with noise, promises, and illusions, but none of it will fit, because the peace you seek is not a place, not a person, not a perfect moment. It is a state of presence. It is when light and shadow stop fighting inside you. The question is, how long will you wait before sitting in that place? How long will you negotiate with your own soul, trying to postpone the inevitable? The forgiveness you avoid, the compassion you resist, the cross you refuse to carry. These are exactly the way back home, and no one can make this crossing for you. So here's my invitation. Start today. Start small, but start. And if this message has awakened something within you, share your thoughts, because sometimes your words are the first step for someone else to come home too. Subscribe, turn on the notifications, and walk with me, because this journey is only beginning.